Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Bednars, and I am a junior doctor in Dundee, Scotland, and you're listening to the Patient Will See You Now podcast. I have to say, this podcast is for educational use only, and you should not be using this as medical advice or opinion. Please go see your doctor if you have any medical questions. This podcast is supposed to be fun and educational. So now that I got that out of the way, let's get into this week's topic. So, in this week's episode, we're going to be talking about Crohn's disease. And Crohn's disease is one of two diseases that makes up the inflammatory bowel diseases, IBD. Not to get it mixed up with IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome. Inflammatory bowel disease are chronic inflammatory disorders. The cousin disease is called ulcer. So, in this week's episode, we're going to be talking about Crohn's disease. And Crohn's disease is one of two diseases that makes up the inflammatory bowel diseases, IBD. Not to get it mixed up with IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome. Inflammatory bowel disease are chronic inflammatory disorders. The cousin disease is called ulcerative colitis, which will be talked about in a later episode. But you'll see in this episode that this guy, he had ulcerative colitis first and then later was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. So, like I said, just cousin diseases because they look similar. Since I have a strong Polish background and finishing medical school in Wrocław, Poland, I have to mention that the first time that an inflammation of the terminal ileum was founded by a Polish surgeon back in 1904. And to this day in Poland, the disease is actually called Leśniowski Crohn's disease. But to make it easier for today, we'll just call it Crohn's. It's a mouth to anus disease, and that just means that the lesions of Crohn's can happen anywhere from the oral cavity all the way down to the anus via the GI tract. Usually, it's localized to the terminal ileum, which is the final part of the small intestine, and the cecum, which is the beginning part of the large intestine. This is also an immune related disease, but not an autoimmune disease. And that just means that there is a pathogen triggering the immune system to go bonkers. Whereas in autoimmune disease, the immune system gets triggered by the body's own cells. So, epidemiology of Crohn's disease is usually that females get males. The age of onset is anywhere between 15 and 30 and 16 to 80, but they can occur at any age. There's a higher incidence in Crohn's in Ashkenazi Jews, and smoking aggravates Crohn's disease. And I say that because in ulcerative colitis, smoking can actually prevent it. So, if there's anything that smoking is good for, it's ulcerative colitis. But as a doctor, I can't say that smoking is ever good. So, if you're smoking, try to quit. And if you're not smoking, stay away from it. So, what causes Crohn's? Well, the cause of this is unknown, or as some doctors like to call it, idiopathic. However, it is believed to be due to a combination of environmental and genetic and bacterial factors. And I'm just going to list them for you. So, environmentally, it could be by the microenvironment of your body, your diet, infections, stress, non steroidal anti inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen, smoking, and antibiotic use. Some genetic ones, interestingly, is there is an increased risk if family members also have Crohn's. And there's actually a genetic mutation in CARD15 gene. Not important right now. And some bacterial ones are Mycobacterium paratuberculosis, Pseudomonas, and Listeria. Just wanted to mention them just for my own sake. But now let's explain the pathogenesis of this disease, or exactly what's happening in the body when you have Crohn's. So I need to break down what the layers of a GI tract are, and I have to do it in a way audibly for you to imagine it. So the best way I can describe it is by think ridiculous, but work with me here. Now imagine looking at the burrito from the top. You can see all the stuff inside, and let's also imagine that this is a perfectly made burrito where you can see each layer separately. The outside part is the tortilla. Next, let's say it's the chicken around. Then going towards the middle, you got your veggies and beans, and then in the middle, it's the rice. All right, maybe it's not a perfect burrito, but just work with me here, all right? So let's cut it in half now. In a way, so you can see the rice on top, which was in the dead center of the burrito, and then under the rice, you have the veggies and beans, and then under that is the chicken, and under that is the tortilla. Hopefully, you got this image. The rice will be our epithelial cells, and they're pretty good from letting any bacteria getting into the burrito, or I mean intestinal layers. However, in Crohn's, it's thought that these epithelial cells, or rice in this case, are weaker than the other cells, and the immune cells that help us get in there and kill the bacteria. Good, right? Not exactly. You see, there are special cells around the rice. So let's say it's a few pieces of white rice that in that mixture of the Spanish rice, and they're M cells. And they let some bacteria come into the intestine, and we let our immune system kill it in an orderly fashion. However, in Crohn's, the epithelial cells are weaker, which lets more bacteria inside, and the immune cells, unfortunately, go a little overboard trying to kill all the bacteria and release what we call cytokines that causes a bunch of damage and inflammation. The most important cytokine is the tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF alpha for short. And I need you to remember that for later, all right? It's called the TNF alpha. And we also have other cells that try to make a barrier around these bacteria, leaving us with granulomas inside, which later alpha. And we also have other cells that try to make a barrier around these bacteria, leaving us with granulomas inside, which later, once the bacteria come to a halt, our immune system cleans all this up, but they do this by destroying the good cells in our body, and that leaves with some destruction throughout the whole wall of our intestinal tract. Now, going back to the burrito, imagine a hole that you can see through in the middle. No rice, no veggies or beans or chicken, just or not even a tortilla. The tortilla even got ripped through. There's a nice hole from the top to the bottom. Now, stuff in the intestine can leak out, and that can cause some huge problems. This is called a transmural inflammation, where the whole thickness of the intestinal wall gets necrosed. And this can happen anywhere from the oral cavity to the anus, but again, most commonly affecting the ileum and the colon. Small intestine, which are your main organs for reabsorbing water into the body and nutrients, respectively. This explains why people will have bloody diarrhea and also malabsorption. So, some signs and symptoms. Crohn's is a disease that has flares and remissions of these signs and symptoms. So, some of them can be fever, some abdominal pain, usually located in the right iliac fossa or the lower right quadrant of your abdomen. So, sometimes some doctors can expect it to be appendicitis, rightfully so, but it's Crohn's. Diarrhea, sometimes bloody, but not always. Cramps and muscle spasms, and you'll get that abdominal pain. Fatigue, you'll feel really tired, and a lot of weight loss. And if you're a younger person that has Crohn's, even some growth retardation can happen. Some growth retardation can happen into local complications and systemic complications. Let's talk about the local ones. So we have to continuously monitor patients to make sure we prevent from these local complications from happening. Um, so some of them are strictures, which is the main reason for surgery to avoid obstruction, and a stricture is just a narrowing in a section of the GI tract. Fistula, when you have two bits of organs connecting each other. One, for example, is the colon can have a fistula with the bladder. And one funny thing about this is if somebody has that is when they go for a pee, it kind of makes a whistling sound coming out. And that's because there's air getting into the bladder. Um, Also, perforation, stenosis, which is like a hardening of some part of the GI tract, abscesses, granulomas, and unfortunately, even colon cancer can occur. Some part of the GI tract, abscesses, granulomas, and unfortunately, even colon cancer can occur. Some systemic complications, they're systemic because it's an immune related disease, but not autoimmune disease, which the immune system gets triggered by its own cells. Some of them is conjunctivitis, mouth ulcers, liver abscesses, venous thrombosis, large joint arthrosis. So it's just like a reactive arthritis, inflammatory arthritis. It's usually the most common one. Gallstones and kidney stones, and these two skin ones. One of them being erythema nodosum, which are like patchy bruising, red nodes, usually on the shins, and pyoderma gangrenosum. It's not common, fortunately, but they're just ulcers on skin anywhere. So to diagnose Crohn's, the best thing is a fiber optic camera that goes up your butt and to see your whole colon. And this is the best way to diagnose Crohn's disease. However, it's only 70% effective, with other tests being less effective. So that's why the colonoscopy is most efficient for diagnosing Crohn's, with a biopsy of the colon as well. The reason why it's not 100% effective in Crohn's is because Crohn's has something called skip lesions. So a colonoscopy can catch a lesion or two, or it might completely miss one. Ulcerative colitis is easier to diagnose because it starts in the rectum and it goes up, uh, meaning towards your body, and you'll get all these ulcers in your colon, and it kind of just does it in a continuous way, whereas Crohn's, it skips along. So you can have a few lesions in the colon and then a few in the small intestine and then in different spots in the small intestine. It's just not continuous. So that's why it's a little harder to there are many other tests we can do, but an interesting one that some might not know about is a pill that a patient can swallow, and it has a camera inside, and this can go through your whole digestive tract, recording everything. Uh, it sees by taking a bunch of photos and then wirelessly sends photos to receivers. So yes, the camera is supposed to come out eventually, and Crohn's is diagnosed with endoscopic and radiologic findings with a compatible clinical history to support it. So let's talk about treatment of Crohn's. Crohn's, unfortunately, is not a curative disease, but it is manageable. The first thing we tend to tell our patients to do is to have a lifestyle change, and biggest one is to stop smoking, and usually change their diet with like a high fiber and fruits, since fats and meat can increase the risk, and eating small meals frequently. You're just trying to avoid any kind of inflammation. That's why we try to avoid fats and meats, because meats can cause inflammation to your GI tract and most of your organs. Most patients will be taking prednisone, which is a steroid to decrease the functions of the immune system so that it doesn't go bonkers. Prednisone, however, has so many side effects, unfortunately, but the benefits just outweigh them. So I don't know if you remember earlier, but I remembered I mentioned a cytokine called TNF alpha. Uh, so we have a biological drug that inhibits this TNF alpha, and it's called adalimumab. Brand name is Humira. And it can be used alone or with other drugs like methotrexate as well in severe diseases. Another biological drug is Inflectra or infliximab. We sometimes give antibiotics to control the gut bacteria and also decrease immune response because some antibiotics have that capability as well. Surgery doesn't cure Crohn's disease and only happens usually when abscesses, perforations, strictures, or fistula are involved. We tend not to do surgery because that can also trigger a flare up in the disease and just cause more necrosis and more damage. So let's get to this interview coming up. This is Josh, who has Crohn's disease, and I hope you enjoy the interview.
Hello?
Hello, good evening. Is this Josh?
Is this Robert?
Yes, it is. This is Robert from the Patient Will See You Now podcast. How are you, Josh?
That's a pretty nice day. Been doing some hard work. Today's Theodore Roosevelt's birthday, so it's always a good day to work hard.
Patient will see you now podcast. How are you, Josh?
That's a pretty nice day. Been doing some hard work. Today's Theodore Roosevelt's birthday, so it's always a good day to work hard.
Oh, I did not know that actually.
Yeah, October 27th. The strenuous life.
Huh. You learn something new every day, huh?
Right on, Rob.
So, Josh, how about we get right into it? Is that all right with you?
Absolutely.
So, if you can just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what do you have, and I guess just how did it all start, and when did you notice something was different, just from the beginning?
Great. So I'm Josh Lipovetsky, and I would classify myself as I seek light in every situation. Like if I want to sum it down, I guess I'm a light seeker. I seek the good and beauty. And my life up until age 15 was pretty. It wasn't very tumultuous externally. All whatever tumultuousness that was going on was inside my mind. But when I was 15, I noticed some rectal bleeding going on, and it was not really alarming. I don't know why. I always had some kind of this strong faith that I'm always on the right path. So even if there's something really wrong with my body, I'm always living on some kind of spiritual existence, which really served me when Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis got really bad and really intense. It really helped dissociate a little bit to have that skill. So it basically started at age 15 with light rectal bleeding. Went in, had not put on Lialda, a little bit of mesalamine pills. Didn't really do anything. Was told I could eat whatever I wanted, so I kind of did that. 2 months later, I was hospitalized with the hemoglobin of about 5.7. So it went from like really light rectal bleeding to just buckets of blood. And steroids didn't really help. We got on Remicade, and that helped a little while. But about 8 months later, I had a total colectomy, so I had the ostomy put in. This was now at age 16. And after that, it was a bit of a nightmare after that, but somehow we managed every single way. Thank God. I don't know where I got. I just thanks to God, I somehow have been able to make it through. I'm 27 years old now, so there's a lot of inflammatory bowel disease.
Matt, so in terms of Crohn's disease, that age group usually between 15 to 30, and then later it's like 45 to 60, somewhere around there. Those are usually the age groups that people who have Crohn's or IBD would get diagnosed. I can only imagine how tough that is, being 15 years old and then later 16 getting a total colectomy. Did I hear that right?
Total colectomy and ileostomy, yes, sir.
Total colectomy and an ileostomy. Can you say maybe what went through your mind? How did you manage through all of that?
Sure. Yeah, it was not difficult at all, actually. That particular phase of my illness was the easiest time for me, mainly because when I was 15, I had such a strong reserve of optimism. I don't know where it came from. My parents, my family. I had
through all of that.
Sure. Yeah, it was not difficult at all, actually. That particular phase of my illness was the easiest time for me, mainly because when I was 15, I had such a strong reserve of optimism. I don't know where it came from. My parents, my family. I had amazing, and continue to this day, have amazing support system. I was journaling, and I was also on 40 milligrams of prednisone at the time, and that gave me a lot of energy. The cortisol definitely gave me a lot of energy to help cope with my situation. So I was just so optimistic, and I had so much hope that doing this ostomy, because it was presented to me, we did a capsule study beforehand, and it was presented to me that I have ulcerative colitis. All of my inflammation is localized to my large intestine, and if you remove it, you will be cured, and all you have to do is trade your large intestine for an ostomy bag. It's a trade that you make. It's a sacrifice. Easy. The date of the surgery, September 30th, 2008, I remember, was one of the happiest days of my life. I was so happy. I was hanging out, chilling with the nurse, because I knew I was going to get a clean bill of health. And that's why it was all pretty easy. It was like I was going on like some kind of vacation. Those 8 months where I was in and out of the hospital bleeding. I was at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. It was like a social playground for me. All the nurses, doctors, the people who came in and cleaned your room every day. Just have amazing conversations with them. It was a wonderful vacation. And I said it. I had a hospital visit recently, and I said to my doctor, I was like, "Wow, if I could have this experience, this social experience, hanging out with all the people, all the nurses, without being sick, like that's a good place to be."
It sounds
That's not
like
a bad place to be.
it sounds like all the people at the hospital really also helped you keep getting motivated and kept going forward and just made it seem really comfortable in everything you were going.
Yeah, they made it as comfortable as can be. I mean, it was. Of course, I am wearing rose-tinted glasses right now in this interview. I don't want to give off an impression that everything was good. I was losing lots and lots of blood. I had probably like 20 units of blood in those 8 months, maybe 15, 20. I had a lot of blood transfusions and a lot of soiled linens, to say the least. Things were really bad, but I just kept my head in the clouds. I was really good at doing that.
So during this time when you were like 15, 16, I'm guessing you were going to high school at the time, right?
Yes, sir.
So how was it? How was life in high school at the time?
I loved high school. I loved school. High school, this was 10th grade, so I just left 10th grade, and I didn't tell anyone. And I still am, if I didn't have people can visibly see that something is wrong with me right now, I would probably hide it as much as I could, because I don't want people to feel bad for me, people to feel sorry or anyway. So I kind of just went in the hospital, didn't really tell anyone what was going on. I remember about 1 month later, I came back and people were looking at me with this crazy face like, "You, Joshua, you just disappeared off the face of the earth. Where the heck were you?" And I remember in response, I said, "I was a little sick. It's okay, I'm better now." It's like this optimistic attitude that I really am grateful that I have, that I was given that attitude. But I just loved school, and it was such a blessing to be back in school. It was so good. I had to drop out after 10th grade, and I tried to go back a little bit in 11th grade, but I had an online school that I was able to transfer to and get my internet. I tell you, this illness has been so difficult, but so much of life can be lived on the computer in lieu of not being healthy enough to go outside for prolonged periods of time. So I've been able to build a lot of beautiful things just in my room. It's great.
That is amazing. Having the internet definitely can, at least nowadays, people who had a rough time not being able to go out or do anything, that's all changed now that we have the internet. And there's so many things that you could just do at home online. Just create and just be creative as much as you want.
Exactly. There's so much creative opportunity now. It's great.
So I can only imagine when you were 15, when you were diagnosed with, now is this Crohn's or ulcerative colitis? Because it sounds more like
it was initially ulcerative colitis, and it was only ulcerative colitis. The Crohn's disease developed after the ostomy surgery later on.
Gotcha. So when you ulcerative colitis, because it sounds more
it was it was initially ulcerative colitis, and it was only ulcerative colitis. The Crohn's disease developed after the ostomy surgery later on.
Gotcha. So when you were 15 years old and you got this diagnosis, how did you feel? Have you ever heard of this before, or did you have an idea of what this could be, or just what were your overall feelings at first?
My feelings were just rolling with it. I said, "Oh, it's just blood coming from, I'm pooping blood. Oh, well." That was basically it. I wasn't that deep about it. I wasn't existential about it. A little bit more existential and deep about it now. But back then, I didn't have many deep thoughts about it. was so much faith. I was blessed with a lot of faith that whatever, it's almost like a denial a bit. There, I must have had a very evolved mechanism of denial at that time to be able to just roll with it completely. There wasn't shock, there wasn't trauma, there wasn't any of this, any of that. It was just, oh, I'm just chilling, I'm just living life, and this is. I saw it as some trial that I saw it as some kind of temporary illness trial that God put me through, that God wanted me to go through in order to learn some kind of a lesson. I thought it would be like 8 months or several months. I thought it was some kind of little temporary illness because you just start bleeding. Like, well, what's up with that? It's got to go away, right? It didn't, but so that's kind of upsetting. But at the time, I didn't know, thankfully. I didn't know the progression of how bad the illness was going to get. So it didn't really bother me that much.
Like, oh, this is a permanent thing to you.
Never. It still hasn't. It's been 11 years and I'm not that accepting of it. That's okay. But when it became more serious, I would say more severe, would be after the surgery. I had about 3 good weeks after the surgery where I had hope that things were going to get better. And then just one day I call it like a day from hell, where I just ended up having the most severe stomach pain of my life. I hadn't had much severe pain from the colitis. When I was bleeding, it hurt a little bit to go to the bathroom, and I was bleeding, and that was very painful and not that painful, but it was painful and uncomfortable to have bowel movements. But that was about it. And there was some stomach pain. But this was something else. This was like severe stomach pain. Like I had never experienced anything like this before. And we ended up going to the emergency room. Still didn't know what was going on. Eventually the pain would come back and the symptoms completely shifted. Instead of bloody bowel movements now, all of a sudden it was severe stomach pain. You can't eat, you can't drink, and you start throwing up blood from your intestines. It's just blood throwing up. It was ridiculous. Like it was so far-fetched, the symptoms, and so painful and so ridiculous. That's when I was still very optimistic that things would get better, but that was when things got a little more serious because I had just made that sacrifice, the ostomy bag. And now the illness is getting worse. After you're telling me that the illness is getting worse now after I've made the sacrifice, that was painful. It still is painful to think about.
Yeah, I could definitely imagine that.
Yeah.
And with the ileostomy bag, in a doctor's point of view, will help you. This will improve your quality of life. But how did you see it from like the beginning of getting this ileostomy bag up until now? Do you feel more used to it? Are you embarrassed by it? Maybe a little bit about that, what that lifestyle is like, having that.
That's a great question, Robert. So the ostomy bag was definitely a mixed bag. Definitely a mixed bag of feelings. I was really concerned, like, what about having sex with that? Will a woman find me attractive? Will this be really inconvenient? What about how long can I go out places without having to go to the bathroom? Am I going to have to always be worried about a bathroom being nearby? Is it going to be inconvenient? Things like that. And honestly, all the issues about the ostomy bag have been so eclipsed by the severity of the illness, things like that. And honestly, all the issues about the ostomy bag have been so eclipsed by the severity of the illness that I don't really pay much attention. I'm just like right now, I'm coming off of a very recent fistula surgery. I've had 2 fistulas form right around the ostomy to the point where it's so bad that if I have a functioning ostomy, it's like, hallelujah. It's like, praise the Lord, because things have been, again, so bad that I haven't really had time to think about a lot of this stuff. But yeah, I remember there was a time in the hospital when the bag was leaking and I was screaming. I was so frustrated with it. And Yeah, the leaking was really bad. Thankfully, we found Convatec. The Convatec two-piece system, for anyone listening who has an ostomy, was very helpful. You got to snap it. I snap it on. The two-piece system, I snap it on before. That's a better strategy. And leaking was pretty much minimized, which also minimizes a lot of the emotional trauma associated with it, because most of the trauma from an ostomy bag, from my point of view, is the leaking. It's the leaking.
And what was leaking? It was just leaking blood, diarrhea, or what was?
Usually I didn't have much. At the time, I don't think I had that much diarrhea. It was just poop, just regular poop.
And it was coming.
Maybe a little bit of diarrhea.
It was leaking out of the insertion point, or
not out of the insertion point. Thankfully, it just leaks when maybe you are laying down and the contents of the bag kind of go up towards the skin, and they kind of go underneath the wafer.
All right.
So that kind of leak, like a light one, a mild one, not actually having to do with the anatomy.
A light one, but still, nobody wants a leak happening with them.
Nobody wants that.
So you're saying this new one that you have, this one works a lot better, right?
Yeah, actually, I'm coming off of the surgery about 2 months ago.
So
this is my third. This is my third ostomy, actually.
Your third ostomy already.
Yeah.
Oof. So we know some of the bigger changes that happened. We know you got the total colectomy. You currently have an ileostomy bag, right?
Yes, I do.
And your overall quality of life. What are maybe some tiny small changes that might have happened that maybe people wouldn't really have thought about, or I don't know, just things that you probably even noticed, like, oh, that's really frustrating. I never thought this was going to happen because of this.
That's a great question. That's a great question. I've never been asked before. Tiny changes. Yeah, normally, because there have been a lot of big changes, but as for tiny changes, I would say not being out for too long because you get fatigued. That's probably from the steroids and the way it changes the cortisol mechanism in the body. You kind of get tired more often, and that can set off the ostomy. So stress, you really have to manage that. Even the good stress of going to college really set me off constantly in flare-ups. So you really got to watch college. What else? So the leaking is one thing. With the tube feeds, we would later get on tube feeds. Sometimes tube feeds leak often, so you really have to watch that. You've got the backpack on and you've got wires on you. Sometimes you walk around and the wire gets caught in the doorknob and it's like, whoop, whoops. So you learn to be a little bit more careful when you walk around.
So the backpack and wires, what's there exactly?
Yeah, so this goes back to after the ostomy surgery, and when I mentioned the episode that I had with severe stomach pain and throwing up blood. I was in and out of the hospital every 1.5 to 2 months with the same exact symptom. We could not figure anything out. None of the drugs would work. The Humira in particular. I was on Humira, Remicade, the methotrexate, and nothing worked until my doctor kept insisting to try tube feed. And I didn't want to do it because I didn't want to put the NG tube, the feeding tube in my nose. But eventually, this kept getting hospitalized, so we put it in. Ended up being out of the hospital for 2 years and 2 months, the moment that I put in that tube feed. It has been, to this day, so far, besides steroids, it has been the only drug, non-steroidal drug, that has managed my Crohn's disease. And I've been on continuous tube feeds, basically 24 hours a day for the past 10 years, since September of 2009.
Wow.
That's when I started it. I've tried to get off, 40 or 50 times, where you take off the tube and you just try to start eating food, whether it's paleo, whether it's vegan or carnivore, whatever the diet du jour is, that's what I try. So far, I have not had success. The tube feeds have been extremely therapeutic. So you walk around with the backpack and you've got the pump, it goes into your nose and stomach. And yeah, you basically refill it a couple times a day. Sometimes the formula leaks a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal.
So is there food constantly going inside the whole time,
Yes,
or
sir. I'm eating right now as we're talking. There's a tube in my nose.
well, enjoy your food. Guten appetit.
Thank you.
Um,
Yeah, it's pretty
so
cool.
so this is something that it's even when you're sleeping, you're feeding as well.
Yes, sir. A lot of people do night feeds.
Are you?
Tried night feeds. I haven't had success much.
Mhm. So my next question: are you still able to eat solids and fluids?
Yes, sir. I am able to eat the solid foods. I'm actually eating ground beef these days, grass-fed ground beef, one meal a day, and it's been quite helpful. I have had success with it. I've tried vegan. Vegan has been it's been very challenging to say the least. And I've even read on vegan websites like this applies to everyone, but if you have Crohn's disease in particular or any form of inflammatory bowel disorder, be careful with the vegan diet. It's like the one diet that's very interesting. But yes, it's been interesting. It's been a real challenge. And when the days are good, the days are really good. And when the days are bad, they're really bad. But that's life.
So what about when you go out with your fink or to a restaurant? What is it
Hmm.
like there? Do you have options for yourself? Are you I'm assuming if you're taking like methotrexate, you wouldn't be able to drink alcohol, or do you drink alcohol?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not on methotrexate now. That was a while ago. These days, I'm just on steroids. All the other drugs didn't work. I don't drink, but when I go out to restaurants, I'll order. I usually order, Sometimes I'll order the chicken fingers with fries. Chicken, for whatever reason, I have not had success with lately at all. Back maybe 5 years ago, or when the disease was first forming, chicken was okay. Now it's basically just beef. Beef is basically what I eat. Chicken has become pretty intolerable to my system.
So
But at restaurants, yeah,
when you say that the chicken's unsuccessful, what do you mean by that?
it sets me off. It gives me diarrhea. Bad kind of that. There's a good kind of weird to say, but now there's a good kind of diarrhea, and there's a bad kind. And this one is bad. It gives me stomach pain. It makes my stoma, my ostomy, swell up with inflammation, and it makes me feel extremely lethargic, and sometimes even a little bit difficult to take a full deep breath these days. That's kind of a new development. So chicken is not very good. But then again, this probably is factory farmed chicken, the bad stuff. When you buy the pastured chicken from the expensive websites, I think it goes okay.
Oh, so when you eat like grass, like because you mentioned earlier the grass-fed beef, you
For
say that
sure.
you have a better reaction
Oh,
to
for
that
sure.
than you do from store-bought antibiotic-filled beef or stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Think of me like a thoroughbred racehorse. I need the highest quality nutrition.
That's a good way to put it.
Yes, sir.
So in terms of like going out and stuff, has any of this affected your relationships with either your friends or your family or any partners or just sexual life, anything like that? Has it affected it?
Yeah. So when I go out and I'm in a decent state, the thing about me is if I didn't have the tube, no one would be able to know because I'm so extroverted, social, maybe even slightly rambunctious out in public. So even with the tube, people don't understand the extent of my illness because I don't show it. Even when I'm in a horrific state, like I remember I was in Philadelphia lately and my bag was leaking. And before I had this recent surgery for the fistula, things were just leaking all the time. And there's not much I could do other than get the surgery. So in the meantime, but I still wanted to go out. So I'm kind of leaking there. And I'm still walking around and smiling and laughing. And even in college, I gave a speech, just stuffed toilet paper in there, and then go up there and give the speech. And I got an A in the course. Like that's kind of how I've had to do things this past year. Things just get so ridiculous at some point. So I try not to let it stop me. Relationships I haven't had much success with. I think that's because of generally how stressful it is to get involved in one,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or I'm just not, or just wasn't ready, just not mature enough. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's been a tough slog for sure. with sexual relationships
It's
for sure.
it's definitely different though because of how optimistic you are the whole time. Because I'm sure a lot of people, if they were to live in your shoes for a day, they would not be able to handle it. But you're doing a fantastic job so far, and I think a lot of that because of your optimism, and that's really helping you get through.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I would say that we human beings, we are very resilient, and we can handle pretty much anything as long as it's gradual. They say, I don't know if it's true, but they say, how do you boil a frog? You turn up the water really slowly. It's kind of like that. I, I always draw this comparison. Elon Musk, he's pretty productive. He's got these two companies. He works probably 80 hours a week. But the thing is, think about it, if he starts working 2 hours a day, and then a month later he works 3 hours a day. A couple months later, you up it to 4 hours a day. You'll be able to do that. Pretty much anyone would be able to do that, and eventually get up to like a 40, 50, 60-hour work week if you have the stamina for it. But if you just step into those shoes overnight, it will traumatize you. Same with me. If someone is, it will be traumatizing. Same with me if I were 15 years old and I had this life now at age 27, would be traumatizing. But because it's been gradual, I've been able to develop the skills to cope with it.
So, am I right for saying that you're from the States?
Yes, sir.
So,
Pennsylvania.
Right. So, how is the cost of all this? Because I'm coming from Scotland, where medication is, free and treatment as well. But I know in the United States, there's a huge issue with insurance and medications and stuff like that and treatment. Has there been an issue with the cost of medicine and the cost of all these of all these treatments and the lifestyle? Any with the changes to ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease?
When I was first diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, I was on my parents' healthcare plan. And after my first hospital visit, they threw me off the plan. And we had to parents' healthcare plan. And after my first hospital visit, they threw me off the plan. And we had to petition with the hospital to get charity care for about a month. Huge shout out to my social worker at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for helping me out with that, for transitioning me to that. And then after that, we got on a special children's health insurance program. It was very low cost, if not completely subsidized by the government. And then we applied for disability in 2009, I think shortly after my ostomy surgery. And since then, it has been, thank God, has been covered. I've been on a Medicaid government assistance program, and they've covered it a lot because you could not afford how many days I was in the hospital. Now, probably well over 200 days, 20, 25 hospitalizations, maybe more. The tube feed formula is hours a day. So there's no way we would be able to afford that if not for being fully subsidized by Medicaid. So huge gratitude for that.
That actually sounds really nice. Then, first of all, of the social worker back in the children's hospital, that's amazing that they were able to take care of that for you. And now it's Medicaid. Is that what you said?
Yep, it's Medicaid.
Medicaid is taking care of the costs. Yeah, because I can just imagine with the feeding, you're on it 24 hours. So in about, let's say, a week, how many bags do you go through?
So each bottle is 250 milliliters. It's about a cup, like a cup of water, but it's a cup of formula, and it's 250 calories. I go through probably around 9 per day. So that would be 2,250 calories a day. Yeah, about 2,200 calories a day I get from the formula. So if I go through about one case, it has 24. So we'll just say a case 3 days. That would be 10 cases per month.
Per month. Wow. Yeah, that's a lot.
The 240 bottles a month.
And this is if there's no complications, and then sometimes it leaks, sometimes something breaks, right?
The main, the leaking with the formula, there's not really much of a problem at all. Sometimes when you're pouring, like, this was just a tiny little, to answer your question about tiny little inconveniences in life. Sometimes when you're pouring the formula, your wrist kind of slips and you pour it all over yourself or something, a few drops here, and you have to clean your shirt, things like that, little things. But yeah, other than that, it's fine. The problem is the ostomy bag sometimes leaking. That's tougher to deal with. But the formula's been pretty great. When things are good, I mean they're pretty good. The formula is nice, and it helps me maintain my weight because I have a lot of malabsorption problems.
Josh, before I get to the last question, I wanted to talk to you about something that you mentioned to me in the email. How you have this YouTube channel. I looked through some of the videos there, and it was all about. It's called Lit for Brains, and it's just basically you going through a whole bunch of classic literature and talking about it. I'm not a literature person myself, unfortunately, but it looks like something you're very passionate about, and this is something that gets you really moving forward as well and motivated. Am I wrong to say that?
Absolutely right. Yeah, this is a beautiful thing. This is an offshoot, actually. One of the best things in my life was going to college. Like, after being an online.
Motivated. Am I wrong to say that?
Absolutely right. Yeah, this is a beautiful thing. This is an offshoot, actually. One of the best things in my life was going to college. Like, after being an online college for 2 years for being sick, you can imagine how excited I was to go to an actual building where there were people, like girls too, to interact with. I was 19, 18 years old. So I was so excited. And I took an intro to philosophy class as one of my first classes. And in that class, we read one of the dialogues of Plato. It's called Apology. And it was about the trial and death of Socrates when Greece put him on trial. And he said something there in that dialogue that just struck my soul. He said, "Men, we fear death as if it is the worst of all evils, but we do not know if it may be the greatest of all things that could possibly happen to us." And I was just like, whoa, fearing death. So that led me on this exploration track of classical literature. I ended up getting this book called The Well-Educated Mind by Susan Wise Bauer, talking about how we used to have this classical education system. We had like Latin, Greek. We were taught the Western classics in school, and now it's just modern literature. And I wanted to go back to this. I wanted to really get into that realm because I felt like I've always been a reader, but I was reading a lot of self-help books, which were amazing, self-help and spirituality books. But I wanted to go deep into the culture, the history. So I ended up finding also Mortimer Adler and the Encyclopedia Britannica's great books of the Western world list. This was a 10-year reading list of all these great books like Plato, Aristotle. We had Homer. We even had Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Jonathan Swift, Leo Tolstoy. Dostoevsky really got me going. So I committed to this list. And now I use the list as a general template, and I go through, maybe I'll go through a book that's not on the list. For example, I just did Gilgamesh, the oldest ancient work of literature. It's almost 5,000 years old. I went through the whole book, recorded a YouTube video on it. It's great. Lit for Brains is the channel, and I thank you for asking about it. A huge part of my mission in the world, I seem to be hitting a nerve, and students seem to be helped by the content that I put out. So that is so beautiful.
And that's amazing for so many different reasons because you, a person who is suffering from Crohn's disease, or it doesn't really sound like you're suffering because you're just so optimistic, and listening to you is it's so nice, it's so pleasant. But not only that, are you living with this and this NG tube, but you're other people. You have this YouTube channel, and it's amazing. And honestly, it was what you said earlier was you were so excited when you were 18, 19 years old, and you were able to just go inside a building and just see other people. That was something. It's like so many people take that for granted, and they don't really think about that, where they can just easily leave their house and just go into a car, go to the next thing. And some people complain to go to college or complain to go to work, but you get so excited to leave and go out. And honestly, this is really it's so nice to hear. It's so nice to reflect on all this.
Yeah, it's nice for me too to go back on this because I'm not perfect. I also in certain periods of time when things get when things get really good, I can also forget the really bad time. Things cycle for me too, and I sometimes I become like that as well. So I think, whoa. I sometimes I become like that as well. So I think, whoa. Like I remember the first time after my first hospital visit, I was there for about 11 days and I got discharged. And just being in the parking lot there, it felt like freedom. It's like being in a prison there. And and then you get out. I remember the smell of that parking lot. It was one of the best feelings ever. And going out and just having my dad driving me home, my parents driving me home, and seeing the bridge, going to the grocery store again for the first time. It was so vivid. This was after my first hospital visit. It was amazing. And you really, it's really beautiful. You really get this amazing appreciation for things. And it's so easy sometimes to fall back, to lapse into that thinking, that entitlement thinking. It's so easy. But I really have to check myself a lot to make sure that it's so easy. But I really have to check myself a lot to make sure that I'm honoring my past self.
So, Josh, the last question, which is what I ask all of my guests,
Hmm.
for people who are just diagnosed, and in your case, for either ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, or for people who might know somebody who was just diagnosed, what kind of advice would you give for these people?
And these days, Facebook groups, go to the Crohn's disease Facebook group. I don't think the Facebook groups were available back when I was diagnosed. That is probably the number one thing. Facebook group, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. That's really cool because sometimes you're just so sick and you can't make like a local meetup group. That was a bit far fetched for me, and it still is actually far fetched in kind of where I reside. But really, I would also say find books. That's for me that might not have to do with illness in general, but just find books that interest you. I don't know what category: history, self help, spirituality, archaeology, art, whatever. Books have been such a lifesaver for me. That's why I do what I do at Lit for Brains, because these books, they're not just words on a page. These are life saving devices. So those are the two pieces of advice. The first one, Crohn's related, seek support online if you can. Don't worry if you can't leave the house. And second, read the books that will save your life, that will give you soul. Oh, and of course, movies. Movies are so inspirational. These days, actually, you know what I do? This is actually a very it scares me so much. It might not be good for adrenaline, but afterwards, I feel like spiritually cleansed. I don't know. That's a little strange, but there's another tip. Watch horror movies. People that have it worse. They have it worse.
That's also very true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for being for volunteering to be a part of the show. I it Listening to you has definitely been inspiring. There definitely needs to be more people like you out there who are just optimistic. I really hope that everyone who is diagnosed with anything can have this glimmer of optimism the way that you have it. And again, I appreciate it so much for you being on here talking about your journey through all this. And again, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me, Robert. It's been a pleasure. It's been an honor to speak with
So I wish you the best and probably talk to you soon. All right, Josh?
you. All right. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
You too.
Bye. If you liked this episode, please leave a review and a comment. And if you didn't like this episode, well, also leave a review and just tell me how I can improve it. If you want to be a guest on